The broken promise. My name is Caleb Stone. I'm a Charleston native, born and raised. My family owns a local building supply yard, and I've been practically engaged to Nora Vance since we were kids. Her family runs Vance Estates, a long-standing winery on the outskirts of town. Our families were close, and life was steady. Then, Nora met Julian at a revitalization gala. He was a designer fresh off a plane from Chicago, smooth-talking and charming. Suddenly, she started calling me unrefined. She said I didn't fit her ideal lifestyle. I tried to talk to her twice, but she dismissed our engagement as a childhood joke and told me to stop trying to tie her down with old-fashioned expectations. I stayed silent for 6 months, packed my bags, and moved to Chicago. 3 years later, I returned with my own interior design firm, and Sarah Jenkins is by my side. When Nora looked at me again, her eyes were different, but I'm no longer the man who spends his life waiting for her to turn around. Early summer evening in Charleston's historic district. The sky was a bruised orange, and a humid breeze swept through the cobblestone alleys, rattling the wooden signs at the end of the lane. I'm Caleb Stone, 26, 6'2", wearing a faded navy polo with the sleeves rolled up. Since my father passed, the weight of the family lumber and supply business has rested on my shoulders. I spend my days on job sites, negotiating contracts, and balancing the books. The neighbors say I'm steady, someone you can count on. Nora and I grew up together. It was an unspoken pact between our families. When she broke her leg as a kid, I was the one who carried her to the clinic. When my father died, she was the only one besides my mother who stood by his casket for 10 minutes straight. We didn't need words back then. I thought she understood me. But starting last winter, she stopped coming over for Sunday dinners. If I ran into her at the winery, she was always buried in her phone, offering only a few clipped words before rushing off. I asked if she was tired. She just said she was busy. I didn't push. Then came the night at the Navy Yard. She texted me about a design exhibition and asked me to go. I thought she'd come to her senses, that she wanted to talk about us. I arrived 30 minutes early. The exhibit was in a repurposed industrial warehouse. Hand-drawn blueprints on the walls, glass cases filled with architectural models. It was crowded and loud. Nora was there in a cream-colored sundress, her hair pinned back. She gave me a curt nod, no smile. A man stood beside her. He looked to be about 32, wearing a perfectly tailored light gray suit with a silver watch peeking from his cuff. His gestures were calculated, his voice low but commanding enough to draw the room's attention. This was Julian, Nora's friend. I later found out he was an independent designer from Chicago, recently hired for a downtown urban renewal project. I didn't know any of that then. All I knew was that from the moment I arrived, Nora didn't look at me once. They were standing in front of a floor plan for a historic district renovation. I stepped closer to listen. Julian pointed at the drawing. This kind of heavy-handed, literal design? Nobody wants to see that anymore. I tried to jump in. I wanted to tell them how my family had supplied the materials for the restoration of 3 old courtyards on Broad Street last year. How we'd preserved the structural integrity while adding modern functionality. The moment I spoke, Nora turned to me, her voice cold. Caleb, you don't understand this world. I tried again, asking what they meant by symbiotic space. She cut me off. Caleb, you barely even go to galleries. How could you possibly get it? I shut my mouth. For the next 3 hours, I stood in the corner of the hall, watching them move from one drawing to the next. I watched Nora's eyes light up, watched her laugh, watched her touch Julian's sleeve and tell him, you explain things so clearly. I didn't go near them again. The next morning, I went to the winery. In the back garden, Nora was standing by the trellises, inspecting the vines. The sun filtered through the leaves, catching her face. She wore gardening gloves, moving slowly. Employees were busy in the tasting room. The sound of footsteps was constant. I set a small crate on the stone table. It was something my mother had asked me to bring, a rare vintage of their own reserve, something our families had saved from the year of our arrangement. She'd been saving it for a special occasion. Nora, I said, do you remember when we were kids, playing in these fields? You said you wanted to run this place yourself one day. She didn't look up. What if I do? I just want to ask, what does our engagement actually mean to you? She finally turned, pulling off one glove. She looked at me like I was an uninvited guest who didn't know when to leave. Caleb, you even dress like you're from my father's generation. Why are we still talking about an engagement? She paused. It was a joke our parents made when we were kids. I don't owe you anything. I didn't move. I didn't speak. After a few seconds, I picked up the crate and put it back in my truck. Phoenix. I turned and left. From that day on, I didn't call her. She didn't call me. For the next 6 months, I kept up appearances, job sites, meetings, dinners with clients. Nobody knew I'd tucked her photos into a drawer. Nobody knew I checked my phone every night before bed, waiting for a message that never came. My mom called a few times, saying Nora was just going through a phase that she'd come around. I told her, "Mom, I'm done waiting." The rainy season was coming. I started packing. Blueprints from the shelf, old pens from the desk, receipts from the drawers. Everything went into cardboard boxes. At the very bottom of a drawer, I found a glass marble, clear with a blue swirl. Nora had given it to me in grade school. She said it was her luckiest one. I looked at it for 2 seconds, then put it back in the bottom of the drawer. I didn't take it with me. The movers were coming the next morning. I'd rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago, $2,800 a month. I hadn't told anyone, not even my mother. That night, I sat in the empty living room, my phone face down on the coffee table. Outside, the clouds were heavy, the wind picking up. A storm was coming. I flipped the phone over. The screen lit up. No new messages. I went into settings and turned it to silent. The last message Nora had sent me was from 3 months ago. "Thanks for coming to the exhibit." I hadn't replied. I didn't plan to. I stood up, walked to the balcony, and looked at the lights of the house across the way. I used to go there all the time as a kid. Her room was on the 2nd floor. She used to have green curtains. Now, they were cream-colored. The lights were on, but I didn't know if it was her who turned them on. I shut off the balcony light, went back inside, and sat on the couch to wait for dawn. Tomorrow morning, I'd be gone. To Chicago. I didn't have a plan, and I didn't know if I'd make it. But I knew if I stayed, I'd become someone I didn't recognize, clinging to a promise nobody else remembered, wearing my faded polos, waiting at the winery gates for a sorry that would never come. I wasn't willing to do that. The wind grew louder, followed by the low rumble of thunder. I closed my eyes and thought about that night at the Navy Yard, the way Nora looked at Julian. It wasn't the way you look at a friend. It was something I'd never seen in her eyes when she looked at me. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of my phone. I stood up, put it in the drawer, and locked it. Some roads you have to walk alone. I sat there and waited for the sun. The Chicago chapter before dawn, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked downstairs with my pack. The Charleston rain hadn't started yet, but the air was thick and heavy. I hopped on the airport shuttle and didn't look back. When the plane landed in Chicago, the sun was brutal. I dragged my suitcase out of O'Hare, the hot wind hitting my face, making even breathing feel like a chore. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't pull it out. The apartment was in a busy neighborhood, 2 bedrooms, with food trucks and cafes downstairs. The landlord said the last tenant was a musician who played late into the night. I dropped my bags, changed the sheets, and mopped the floor. At 3 p.m., my phone rang. It was HR from a design firm, telling me to report at 9:00 a.m. tomorrow for my first day as an assistant designer. I didn't call home. I didn't tell my mother where I was. The next day, I left at 7 a.m., wearing a crisp new white shirt with the top 2 buttons undone. The firm was on the 16th floor of a glass high-rise. The receptionist led me to a conference room. My supervisor, a guy named Miller in his 30s, looked at me over his glasses. He flipped through my resume. "From South Carolina? Construction background?" "Yes," I said. He smirked. "So, you know your way around a crew?" "Do." "Good. Just remember, modern design isn't about experience. It's about logic and presentation." He pushed the resume aside. "Don't bring that small-town muscle here to coast." I didn't say a word. He told me to start by organizing the last 3 years of project data into the system. I sat at a corner desk and opened the computer, starting with an old warehouse conversion. The blueprints were missing structural detail notes, so I added a few based on my experience in Charleston, specifying material grades and estimating timelines. The lead tech walked by, glanced at my screen, and said nothing. But before he left that night, he told me, "Keep it up tomorrow." I stayed until 11:00 p.m. On the way back to my apartment, the convenience stores were closing. I bought a pre-made sandwich and ate it sitting on my front steps. The next week, I arrived early every day, going through the data line by line. I found a project where the load-bearing wall specs were vague. I pulled up records from 3 similar builds I'd done back home and created 3 different comparison charts, complete with cost and timeline projections. At the weekly meeting, the team was debating the structural plan for a new showroom. A senior designer named Frank suggested tearing down an old wall to create an open concept space. I spoke up. "You can't fully remove the load-bearing structure in a building that age. Keeping part of it save a fortune on reinforcement costs." Frank looked up. "What do you know? This is a commercial space, not a job site." I didn't argue. I just handed him the printed diagrams. He flipped through them and sneered. "Sentimentalism doesn't save a budget." When the meeting ended, the project manager, Sarah Jenkins, called me over. She was nearly 30, with short hair and a no-nonsense attitude. "You don't lack data," she said. "You lack rhythm." Clients don't want a pile of numbers dumped on them. I nodded. She handed me a folder. This is the feedback from the client's last 5 projects. See what they actually care about. I took it without hesitation. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the floor. The next day, I wore another new shirt, top buttons undone. No one asked me to lunch, so I grabbed a sub and ate in the stairwell. I heard 2 colleagues nearby gossiping about who Miller had yelled at today and who was sucking up to the CEO's daughter. Then I heard one say, "Did you hear about that girl Nora Vance? Apparently, she dumped her fiancé back home, some blue-collar guy in building supplies." The other laughed. Probably couldn't even make a PowerPoint. He wouldn't last a day here. I didn't look up. I finished my sandwich, folded the wrapper neatly, and tossed it in the trash. That night, I volunteered to do the 3D renderings. I was still tweaking the BIM models long after everyone else had left. My phone stayed on silent in the bottom of my drawer. At 2 a.m., I closed my laptop and walked home. It was raining, the water soaking through my shirt, but my head was clear. I was the last to leave for 4 nights in a row. On the 5th morning, the creative director did a walkthrough. He looked at my screen and asked Miller, "Who's training this guy?" Miller stammered, "He's not officially assigned yet." The director said, "Have him assist Sarah Jenkins on the next phase. This guy can handle the heavy lifting." That afternoon, Sarah came to my desk. She asked if I could have the first draft of a new proposal ready by next week. "I can," I said. She nodded. "Don't just give me data, give me a narrative." I asked her what she meant. "Make them feel something when they walk through the space," she said. I spent the whole night thinking about it. The next day, I hit the library and visited a few old industrial sites to take photos. While I was working on the proposal that night, my phone buzzed. It was my mom. Her voice was shaky. "Caleb, the day you left, did Nora come to say goodbye?" I held the phone silent. "The Van Cess sent over a jar of peach preserves," she continued. "They said it was the kind you liked when you were little." "Yeah," I mumbled. "If your father were here, he wouldn't want you so far away by yourself." "Mom," I said, "I'm eating street food that tastes just like home. I'm fine." She paused. "Have you lost weight?" "No, eat." We hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed, opened the drawer, and pulled out that blue swirl marble. I looked at it for a long time, then opened my toolbox and shoved it into the very bottom, clicking the lid shut. I went back to the proposal. I added 2 pages of hand-drawn sketches, showing the old warehouse transformed into a modern co-working space. I submitted it as the sun was coming up. A few days later, Sarah announced in the meeting that the proposal had been approved. The client was thrilled. No one clapped, but a few people looked at me differently. On my way home, a notification popped up on Instagram. Nora had posted. It was a photo of a man's back, Julian Thorne, standing in a gallery in Charleston. The caption read, "I think I finally understand what you meant by symbiotic space." Location, Charleston. I stood on the sidewalk as it started to rain. I didn't like the post, but I didn't close the app. I checked the weather for Charleston. Severe thunderstorm warning. Just like the day I left. I stood there, water dripping from my hair. The screen dimmed. I flipped the phone over and shoved it into my jacket pocket. The next day, during the team meeting, Sarah said I'd be responsible for the structural portion of a new community center project. Miller cut in. "He doesn't have enough experience. He'll blow it." Sarah looked at him. The client didn't have a single question about the structure in the proposal he drafted. I kept my head down, taking notes, my pen leaving a long, steady line on the paper. After the meeting, Sarah walked by my desk and set a coffee down. "Stop pulling all-nighters," she said. "The work never ends." I looked up. "Thanks." She didn't leave. "You were doing well back in Charleston, weren't you?" I hesitated. "I suppose." "Then why come here?" I didn't answer. She didn't push. She just walked away. I stayed late again that night. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a bank notification. My first real paycheck had cleared. I stared at the numbers for a few seconds, then locked the screen. As I packed my bag, my pen rolled off the desk. I leaned down to pick it up. When I looked up through the floor-to-ceiling glass, I saw the entire city glowing with a million lights. Moving forward as water dripped from my hair into my collar, the screen went dark. I stood on the sidewalk, unmoving. That photo was burned into my mind. Julian in the center of the gallery, Nora's hand on his shoulder, the shot framed perfectly to show their silhouettes. "I finally understand," she'd written. The rain intensified. I flipped the phone over and shoved it into my inner pocket. The next morning, I was awake at 6 a.m. before the alarm. The apartment walls felt damp, the lampshade yellowed at the edges. I sat up, pulled the phone from my jacket, and turned it on. The Instagram post was still there. I tapped on Nora's profile, hesitated for a beat, and then hit mute. Then I went through my apps and left the Charleston neighborhood groups, the high school alumni chats, and the winery supplier threads. Finally, I set my phone to work-only mode, allowing only Sarah and my mother to get through. By the time I was done, the sun was up. I changed my shirt, left the top buttons undone, and grabbed a breakfast burrito on my way to work. At the office, the floor was empty. I opened my computer and started digging into the community center project. Sarah had put me in charge of the structural design. I didn't ask questions. I just pulled up blueprints for 3 similar projects. One was a site in the East Loop that had been finished last year. They'd gutted the load-bearing walls and ended up blowing the budget on reinforcement. I pulled up my records from the historic renovations back in Charleston. We'd used steel frames to support the original walls, saving nearly $40,000. I organized the data into a spreadsheet, created a comparison model, and proposed keeping specific sections of the original walls as anchors. It would be more stable and cut steel costs by 12%. The BIM simulation ran smoothly. No one asked me to lunch, so I had some instant noodles at my desk. 2 colleagues nearby were gossiping about Miller complaining to the director that giving me structural responsibility was a risk. I kept my head down. During the afternoon meeting, the lead architect presented the exterior concepts. When it was my turn, the room went quiet. I plugged in my drive and opened the BIM model, running the load-bearing simulation. This foundation is prone to uneven settling, I explained, pointing to the dynamic chart. Gutting it is a mistake. Keeping these 2 walls and adding horizontal steel beams will distribute the pressure. Frank frowned. That's a conservative approach. It's a budget approach, I countered, switching to the cost analysis. The original plan calls for 86 tons of steel. This one uses 69. It also shaves 5 days off the construction schedule. The lead tech leaned in, studying the screen. He nodded. The math checks out. Sarah made a note in her book. Include it in the construction docs for the client. After the meeting, Miller walked past my desk, glanced at my monitor, said nothing, and kept walking. That night, I stayed to finish the node details. By 1 a.m., my eyes were burning, my vision blurring. I rubbed my temples, drank half a cup of cold coffee, and kept double-checking the rebar ratios. Suddenly, everything went black for a second. I gripped the desk, leaning over the keyboard until my vision cleared. I sat back, waiting. Then I heard footsteps in the hall, light steady. Sarah was standing there in a trench coat, holding a takeout bag. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "Just finishing the drawings." She didn't say much. She just set the bag on my desk. It was a bowl of hot seafood gumbo. Taped to the side was a sticky note. "You're no use to a design if you ruin your stomach." I blinked. She turned and left, the sound of her heels fading quickly. I opened the container. The gumbo was thick and spicy, exactly what I needed. I ate every bite. I tucked the empty bag into my drawer, but I kept the sticky note, sticking it inside my notebook. The next morning, I was in at 7:00 a.m. I opened my notebook to the new project page and started my first sketch. The sunlight hit the glass walls, illuminating my desk. I was sketching the section for the entrance hall. I adjusted the column placement 3 times before finally settling on the spacing I'd seen in the old estate houses back home. Those buildings had stood for a century through hurricanes and heat. They didn't rely on just concrete. They relied on balance. At 9 a.m., Sarah came in, looked at my sketch, said nothing, and moved on. At lunch, I went to the cafeteria. As I sat down, Frank walked by and tapped my shoulder. "The client heard about your proposal," he said. "They approved the wall retention." I nodded. "Miller took the day off," Frank added with a smirk. "Said he had a family emergency." I went back to my meal. That afternoon, I reworked the stairwell. I changed the steep double-run stairs to a single run with a gentle landing, better for seniors and parents with strollers. The lead tech saw it and said, "Better flow." Before leaving, I sent the update to the project group. Sarah replied with a simple "received." I stayed late again to work on the electrical and plumbing layouts. Around 9 p.m., I went down to the convenience store for a snack. When I got back, there was a plastic container of stir-fry on my desk with another note: "Stop eating cold food." The handwriting was different from the morning note, but the paper was the same. I ate it and cleaned up. At 11 p.m., as I was leaving, my phone buzzed. My salary had been deposited. I looked at the number and locked the screen. At the elevator, I ran into Sarah coming up from the lobby. "Still here?" I asked. "Forgot something." She looked at me. "Are you always this late?" "Just getting the work done." She nodded. "The client is coming for a site visit next week. Get your presentation ready." "Will do." The elevator arrived. I held the door for her. She stepped in and stood beside me. "Were you like this back in Charleston?" she asked. I didn't answer. She didn't ask again. When the doors opened on the ground floor, she walked out, her coat catching the breeze. I stayed behind for a moment. The next morning, I arrived early to print the presentation materials. At 9:30 a.m., the team met with the client representative. I stood up and began explaining the structural plan. Halfway through, the client interrupted. Will keeping these walls ruin the sense of space? I opened the 3D model. We ran light simulations. By keeping the walls, we lose about 5% of natural light coverage, but we compensate for it with these skylights. The client nodded. And the timeline? Guaranteed, I said. We've already vetted the local contractors and double-checked the material lists. The client closed his notebook and looked at Sarah. He's solid. After the meeting, Sarah caught me. The client wants to see the site next week. You're coming with me. Okay. She turned to leave, then stopped. The gumbo is better when it's hot. I looked up, but she was already gone. I sat back down and started my site inspection log. The sun hit my keyboard. I typed the first word. The truth unfolded. Nora held the phone to her ear, listening to Julian say, I'll call you after my meeting, his voice a practiced honey. She stared at the vines in the back garden of Vance Estates, the leaves curling at the edges under the midday sun. She didn't speak. She waited for him to hang up, but the line was already dead. She put her phone down and walked toward the Adirondack chair where he'd been sitting. It was still warm. She reached down, unzipped the side pocket of the bag he'd left behind, and pulled out his phone. The passcode was her birthday. She typed it in, her fingers trembling. In the gallery, she found photos of 3 different women. One was a woman in a beige dress with her arm around him at the Navy Yard. Another was a girl laughing with him at a cafe. A third was a shot of him in a hotel hallway with a woman in a black coat, taken from an elevator. She tapped into his messages. A Miss Lynn was asking if he was coming over tonight, mentioning she'd bought a new bottle of wine. Someone named Sue had sent a design, asking if the collaboration could use a specific color palette. Scrolling further back, she saw wire transfers. $500, $800, $1, $500. The memos read, reimbursement, dinner, books. She exited and checked his browser history. Paris Art Center lease agreement, co-working space, monthly rates, how to register an overseas studio. She clicked one link. It was for a creative hub on the left bank in Paris. €900 a month for a virtual office address. She stared at the screen. So, the studio in Paris he always talked about was just a mailbox. The phone vibrated, nearly making her drop it. It was Julian. She didn't answer. She shoved the phone back into the bag and stood up. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain. I sat in the office and handed over the final stack of documents. The lawyer skimmed them and looked up. You're sure about the name? Stone and Steel Design? Yes. Registered in Chicago, with a branch in Charleston? That's right. He closed the folder. I'll file it tomorrow. But a heads up, your old firm called. They're looking into non-compete clauses. I nodded. I figured. After he left, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Sarah walked in with 2 coffees, setting one on my desk. You heard? I asked. The whole office knows, she said, sitting down. They're saying you're poaching clients. I'm not. I know. She looked at me. Do you need me to testify? I shook my head. Don't risk your job. I'll handle it. She didn't say anything. Instead, she pulled a flash drive from her purse and set on the desk. Backups of every hand-drawn sketch, every revision log, and every signed client approval from the last 3 years. I also time-stamped every structural solution you personally proposed. I was stunned. When did you do this? The night you were reworking the blueprints, she said softly. I told you don't lack logic. You just need someone to help you present it. I gripped the drive. You're really going back to Charleston? I'm not just going back, I said. I'm taking everything I've learned with me. She looked at me for a moment, then walked out. I plugged in the drive. Every project was categorized by date, perfectly organized. I scrolled to the earliest one, the renovation back in South Carolina. There was my handwritten note in the margins. Keep the wall. Save the budget. It'll last longer. I shut down the computer and called my mother. Mom. Caleb. Her voice was anxious. Is everything okay in Chicago? Are you coming home? I am, Mom. But not because things went wrong. I paused. I'm coming home because they went right. Silence for a few seconds. Does this have something to do with Nora? No, I said firmly. It has to do with me. And I'm not coming alone. Who? Sarah Jenkins. She's coming with me. The line went quiet. Then she asked, is she your girlfriend? I think so, I said. I haven't officially asked, but I'm going to. She sighed. The year your father died, you were only 20. I was so afraid you couldn't carry it all. If he could see you now, he'd be proud. Mom, one more thing. When we get back, I want you to cook a real dinner. I want to introduce her properly. Okay, she said, her voice cracking slightly. It's about time I had a daughter-in-law. Nora sat in the garden, the phone on her lap. She went to Julian's profile. His latest post from 3 days ago was a photo of him in front of a Chicago high-rise. Caption, "New beginnings in the city." In the comments, Miss Lynn had written, "Waiting for you," and Sue had posted a heart. Nora scrolled back to her own post from 6 months ago. "I finally understand." Only 2 likes, Julian's and her own. She deleted the post. Then she deleted every single one of them. The phone rang. It was her father's assistant. "Mr. Vance wants to know if the contract with Mr. Thorne is still on for today. He wants to use the family estate as a case study for his new firm." Nora's knuckles went white. "Miss Vance? Are you there?" "Tell him," she said, her voice flat. "The contract is dead. The estate is off limits." She hung up and set the phone face down on the stone table. The wind blew a design sketch across her feet. It was Julian's symbiotic space draft. In the corner, it said, "Inspiration, the Vance Winery." She grabbed the paper and tore it in half. Then again, and again. The scraps fell like snow. I stood by the office window in Chicago with Sarah. Outside, the city was alive with lights, traffic moving slowly on the Kennedy Expressway. "They dropped the suit," she said. "The lawyer told them the evidence was too airtight. They didn't want the bad PR." I nodded. "We're really leaving next month?" she asked. "Yeah, we'll rent the office first, find a crew. If you're too busy, you can come down later." Stone and steel, she turned to look at me. "I'm not busy. I'm just worried that when you go back, you'll see the old ghosts and get lost in them again." "I won't," I said. "I'm not going back to look behind me. I'm going back to show everyone that the man who left is finally home." She didn't say anything. She just reached in her bag and handed me a document. It was a partnership agreement. Her name was right there next to mine. I looked at her. "I don't want to be a project manager in Chicago," she said. "I want to be your partner in Charleston." I took the document, pulled a pen from my pocket, and signed it. She signed it too. I tucked the agreement away. "When we get back, the first thing we do is hang the sign." "What will it say?" "Stone and Steel Design, Charleston Branch." She smiled. "That's it." With a small line at the bottom, I said, "Founded in Chicago, built in Charleston." She stood beside me as we looked out at the city. Below us, a lone taxi moved slowly through the streets, its lights cutting through the dark. The Charleston returned. The taxi pulled up in front of the city administration building. I stepped out, and Sarah followed with a leather briefcase. She didn't say much, but I could tell her stride was steadier here than it had been in Chicago. Inside, the lobby was quiet. We walked straight to the business registration window and handed over the paperwork. The clerk flipped through the pages and looked up, confirming the name. "Stone and Steel Design, Charleston Branch?" "Yes." "Registered address, 7 South Battery Street?" "That's it." She tapped on her keyboard and asked, "Caleb Stone as principal and Sarah Jenkins as partner?" "Correct." She nodded and pressed the red stamp down. I took the business license, my finger lingering on the gold lettering for a second. I didn't say anything. I just turned and left. Sarah caught up. "What's next?" "The office." We walked down toward the historic district. The 2-story building was something my mother had found through a friend. It used to be an old printing press. The exterior had a fresh coat of gray paint, and the doorframe was new. The key felt heavy in my hand. I slid into the lock, click, and the door swung open. The power was on. The walls were freshly painted, though the floors still had dust from the renovation. I walked to the window and pushed it open. Outside was a narrow alley with a clothesline stretching across it, a few shirts swaying in the breeze. "Smaller than Chicago," Sarah said, looking around. "But it's ours," I replied. "Tomorrow, we hang the sign." She hummed in agreement and started organizing her files. I stood there, running through the plan, registration done, office secured. Next step, letting the locals know we weren't just passing through. 3 days later, I received an invitation from the Design Association. The spring symposium was being held at the Charleston Gallard Center. Usually, they don't invite newcomers, but this time they'd reached out specifically. I suspected someone wanted to see if the Caleb Stone who came back from Chicago was the real deal. I wore a charcoal blazer. Sarah was in a sharp black suit. We arrived after the room was mostly full. As soon as we entered, someone called out, "Caleb? Long time no see." I turned. It was Frank Miller, an old contact from the building supply days. He smiled, handed me a card, and glanced at Sarah. "And who is this?" "Sarah Jenkins, co-founder of Stone and Steel." His eyes widened for a split second before he recovered. "Impressive. A husband and wife team." "Partners," Sarah said coolly. "Not husband and wife." Frank chuckled and moved on. We walked further in, passing a few familiar faces. Some nodded, others looked away. I found a spot in the corner. Sarah went to get some water. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. "Caleb." I looked up. Nora was standing there. She'd changed her hair, and her outfit was carefully curated. She held a glass of juice, looking like she'd been waiting for this moment. I heard you were back, she said with a forced smile. You didn't tell me. I didn't think it was necessary, I said. The smile faltered. I just saw your registration info. It was sudden. Not sudden, I said. I want to come back, so I did. She took a half step forward. How had you been all these years? Phoenix. She started to speak, but Sarah walked up and handed me a folder. The association rep wants to know when you can discuss the proposal, Sarah said. I took it and nodded. Right now. As I turned to leave, Nora reached out. Caleb. I didn't stop. I didn't mean to. I looked back. Nora, I'm not the man who was waiting for you 3 years ago. She stood there, her hand frozen in midair. I didn't look back again. Sarah and I walked toward the conference room. My mother had renovated the old house. She said the old layout was too cramped, so she knocked down some walls and replaced the windows and floors with light-colored hardwood. She handed me the keys herself. Your father's door frame is still there, she said. Everything else is new. The day I moved in, it was drizzling. The next morning at 6 a.m., I went out for the milk and found Nora standing on the porch with a bucket of cleaning supplies. I came to help you get settled, she said. I know this house. We used to... No. I held the door half closed. My mother already handled the renovation. I don't need your help. She didn't move. I just wanted to do something. Nothing you do matters now. She looked down at the floor, her voice dropping. I know you're angry with me. I'm not angry, I said. I just don't need you anymore. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. I can wait. Don't. But I still... Nora, I reached into my pocket, pulled out a new key, and pressed it into her hand. If you really want to help, give me back the key to the past. She froze. The rain started coming down harder, soaking her shoulders. She stood there, her fingers tightening around the old key she'd pulled from her bag. She placed it in my palm. I didn't look at it. I just turned and closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking was soft but final. The day the company sign went up, people stopped to take photos. Some old competitors stood at the mouth of the alley, whispering. I heard he landed 3 major projects in Chicago. Who knows? Could be talk. But the association president said his community proposal passed the first round. I stood by the second-story window, listening to the chatter. Sarah walked over and handed me a cup of tea. The Vance family has been active lately, she said. How so? Nora's father met with the city planning board. He wants Julian Thorne to handle the historic estate renovation. I see. Are you going to bid for it? No. But you grew up there. Exactly. And because I grew up there, I'm not going to let Julian Thorne ruin it. She didn't ask anything else. I looked down at the street. The rain had stopped, and the puddles reflected the new sign. Once the community project is underway, we'll talk about the next step. You want to use the estate as a leverage point? It's not what I want, I said. It's that Nora's father is going to come to me. She smiled. You've changed. Not changed, I said, looking into the distance. I'm just finally doing things my way. There was a knock downstairs. I walked down and opened the door. It was a young guy in work clothes, holding a stack of blueprints. Mr. Stone? I'm from the Builders Guild. The association sent over the structural plans for the 3 historic districts. They said you offered to do the safety audits for free. That's right. He handed them over. The president said if you can actually fix the structural issues on the east side, he'll buy you dinner himself. I took them and nodded. I'll be on site next week. After he left, I spread the plans on the table. Sarah pointed to a corner of one drawing. How do you plan to handle this load point? The old Charleston way, I said, but we'll need steel reinforcement or it won't hold. She grabbed a pen and made a few notes. I looked at her. Tired? No. She looked up. Just hard to believe. Believe what? That you're actually back. I didn't say anything. I just turned to the next page. The sun hit the table, making the lines on the blueprints crisp and clear. I picked up my ruler and marked the first beam. The unmasking as we pulled out of the alley. The sun was blinding. I gripped the steering wheel, my palms a bit sweaty. That moment on the porch had felt like a weight pressing on my chest, slowly sinking. Back at the office, Sarah went in first with the files. I followed. A rep from the Builders Guild was waiting. The permits for the East Side project were approved. I signed the paperwork. Sarah listened in, occasionally clarifying a detail. Once everyone left, she asked, Were you going to say something earlier? It's nothing, I said, shaking my head. I just feel like some things can't be delayed anymore. She didn't push. That afternoon, I scrolled through the design events calendar. My finger stopped on the Charleston Emerging Designers Forum. It was an annual event held at the Gallard Center, and the media usually covered it. Julian had posted about it on Instagram last month, looking sharp in a tie. Exploring the future with colleagues, his caption read. I stared at the photo, then pushed the phone away. Sarah brought in coffee and glanced at the screen. He's still at it? Yeah, I said, putting on a good show. She pulled a file from her bag. This came from my contacts in Chicago. His Paris studio was never registered with any international design body. It doesn't even exist in the French business registry. That European New Talent Award he touts? It was a pay-to-play exhibit. You buy the space, you get the title. I flipped through the pages. The evidence was thorough. Timestamps, payment records with blurred-out account numbers. When did you get this? A few days ago. She sat down. I didn't want to bring it up. I didn't want you spiraling back into all that. I closed the file. It's not about her. It's about the fact that he's still lying. The higher he climbs, the harder he'll fall when people see him for who he really is. She nodded. What's the plan? Get him on stage, I said. Let him talk about his overseas experience in front of everyone. She understood. I can contact the organizers and recommend him as a keynote speaker. I'll leak a few tips to the press so they come prepared with questions. Leave Nora out of it. I added, she's had enough. I know, Sarah said softly. This is just about him. The next day, the news broke. The forum announced a new guest speaker, Julian Thorne. Topic: From Paris to the Low Country, my journey home. The promo photo showed him in a white gallery, abstract paintings in the background. I locked my phone. Sarah sat across from me. Nora registered to attend. She asked me this morning if we were going. Tell her it's a public event. Anyone can go. What if she has a breakdown there? Then it means she's finally waking up, I said. She has to. The day of the event was sweltering. The auditorium was packed with about 200 people, local firms in the front, students and freelancers in the back. Sarah and I sat in the rear, blending in. Julian was in a charcoal suit, every hair in place. The applause was polite but standard. He was a fluid speaker, transitioning from his Parisian daily routine to his reinterpretation of local culture. The slides were slick, the music was curated. People were nodding and taking pictures. I watched him, not hearing a word. Halfway through, the moderator opened the floor for questions. The first was a softball about his vision for Charleston. He handled it perfectly. The second was a reporter asking about his transition back to the States. He laughed and told a few charming anecdotes. Then, Sarah stood up. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice was clear as a bell. Mr. Thorne, you mentioned your independent studio in Paris. Could you give us your French tax ID number? And which agency handled your team's social security filings? The room went dead silent. Julian blinked, then forced a smile. That's a very specific question. We were a boutique firm. Most of our admin was outsourced. And your office address? Was it a private lease or a co-working space? If it was shared, which hub was it? His face paled. I don't recall the specific name offhand. Was it Artlink Hub? She asked, pulling a document from her bag. This is your lease from last July. 3,000 euros a month, but for a single desk in a shared office. Your title of chief designer was a standard perk given to all basic members. Whispers broke out in the crowd. Julian wiped sweat from his brow. Where did you get that? That doesn't prove anything. Furthermore, she continued, the $28,000 you transferred to a Miss Lynn last December. Was that rent? She isn't a client. She's the manager of that co-working space. And the $30,000 in January marked project dividend. She isn't a designer, and she's never been credited on any of your work. The room erupted. People were pulling out their phones. A reporter jumped in. Mr. Thorne, besides Miss Lynn, you've had frequent transfers with 2 other women, one of whom is the landlord of another shared space. Can you explain the nature of these payments? You people, he shouted, his voice cracking. This is a character assassination. I'll sue. We have the contracts, the wire transfers, and the registry data, Sarah said, handing the file to the moderator. The association is welcome to investigate. The moderator looked grim and signaled for security. Julian tried to argue, but no one was listening. Someone yelled, refund. I want my registration fee back. Another person laughed. The Parisian was just renting a desk. He stood on stage, his face turning from red to white. Finally, he grabbed his bag and bolted for the exit. Security intercepted him at the stairs, asking him to stay and provide contact info for the investigation. He shoved them aside and ran out. That's when I saw Nora. She was sitting in the 3rd row, her head down. She stood up now, clutching her purse, her face like paper. She didn't look at Julian, and she didn't look at us. She just walked quickly toward the door. I didn't move. Sarah touched my arm. She saw it. She saw it, I whispered. After the session, the crowd thinned out. As we walked toward the exit, I saw Julian's jacket hanging over a chair, his tie abandoned on a table. No one touched them. The next morning, the Builders Guild called. They said the residents of the East Side heard what happened at the forum and had delivered 2 crates of homegrown vegetables to our office. When Sarah went to pick them up, she found a note tucked inside. Thanks for telling the truth. I put the note on my desk. At lunch, my mother called. She said Nora had locked herself in the back of the winery since yesterday, refusing to see anyone. My mom had gone over this morning. The place was empty, the kettle was whistling, but Nora was nowhere to be found. She'll be all right, my mother said. I know, I replied. I stood by the window, looking down at the street. The sun hit our new sign, reflecting the light. Sarah walked over and handed me a glass of water. I finished the revisions on the construction drawings. Take a look. I took the file and opened the first page. She stood beside me, pointing to a corner. I added a small breakfast bar here, using reclaimed wood from the old estate. I think keeping a few old things isn't a bad idea. I looked at the design and didn't say anything. She didn't rush me. She just said softly, moving forward doesn't mean you have to throw everything away. I closed the folder and nodded. There was a knock at the door. A courier was there with a package. I signed for it and opened it. Inside was an old, leather-bound book, The Art of Viticulture. Tucked inside was a note with no name, just one sentence. I finally see it now. A new beginning after the courier left. I sat at my desk and flipped through the book. The pages were yellowed and worn, the kind of book that had been read 1,000 times. The note stayed where it was. I finally see it now. I didn't say anything. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, pushed aside some old sketches from 3 years ago, and tucked the book inside. The phone rang. It was my mom. The wedding attire is ready. Tell Sarah to come by and try it on, she said. The neighbors are all informed. We're just waiting on the date. I gripped the phone. We've settled on next Saturday. She paused, her voice softening. Good. Sarah is a solid girl. Caleb, don't keep things bottled up. Tell her how you feel. I will, Mom, I said. Next Saturday. I hung up and called Sarah. She picked up on the first ring. The date is set, I said. Next Saturday. She just said okay. She didn't ask why so soon or if we were ready. My mom wants you to try on the dress, I added. I'll go this afternoon, she said. I'll bring the layout for the reception. We need to measure the altar space. Whatever you think is best, I told her. She laughed softly. You're finally learning to listen. I didn't reply, listening instead to the sound of her shuffling papers. A few seconds later, she asked, Did you keep that book? It's in the drawer, I said. I'm not moving it. Good, she whispered. Keeping things isn't always about the person. Sometimes it's about remembering the road you traveled. I know, I said, and I'm not looking back. That afternoon, she arrived at the office. It was a gray, windy day. She came in with a stack of blueprints, her hair a bit windswept. I handed her a cup of tea. She didn't drink it. She just spread the drawings out. The wedding planners think my design is too simple, she said, pointing to a sketch. They say it doesn't look like a real wedding. I looked down. It was her hand-drawn dress design. The hem had the texture of old brickwork, the straps followed the lines of ivy vines, and the back featured a subtle pattern of local palmettos. What do you think? She asked. I think it's perfect, I said. Better than any of those puffy gowns. She laughed. What do you know about puffy gowns? Nothing, I said, looking her in the eye. But I know your work. Every line comes from somewhere real. She looked up at me, her eyes bright, before turning back to the plans. They want veils and floral towers. They say it won't look official otherwise. Then don't use them, I said. We'll do it your way. She didn't say anything else. She just packed up the drawings. Before she left, she looked at me. When you try on your suit, don't look so grim. It'll make my mother sad. I won't, I said. I'm not hiding anymore. The next day, the planner, a guy named Mr. Thompson, came by. He was in a full suit and tie, frowning as soon as he walked in. Mr. Stone, we can't execute Miss Jenkins' design. There's no precedent. The fabrics are hard to source, and the timeline is too tight. I didn't look up from my desk. Then find someone who can. But a wedding is an experiment, he said, his voice rising. With all those guests, what if something goes wrong? Sarah stepped out of the conference room with more drawings. I'll take responsibility. She spread the reception layout on the table. If it rains, we move into the firm's gallery space. The backdrop will be our East Side revitalization model. The altar will be built from reclaimed lumber from the old estates. The lighting will be focused on the people, not the decor. Thompson stared at the plan. It's not traditional. Tradition is just something people made up, she said. Our wedding doesn't need to fit anyone else's mold. I stood up and stood beside her. Do it her way. He started to argue, but I gave him a look that silenced him. He packed his things and left. Sarah didn't look at me. She just kept organizing. I reached up and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my shirt. She looked up and smiled. That's more like it. I've always been like this, I said. On the third day, Nora's father, Mr. Vance, came by. He didn't come inside. He stood by the door with a jar of peach preserves. When I opened the door, he was looking at the ground. She's gone, he said softly, to the mountains out west. She's studying traditional agriculture. I stayed silent. He held out the jar. She said, you'd remember the taste. I took it. I didn't thank him, but I didn't give it back either. He stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away. I set the preserves on the entryway table next to a candle Sarah had bought. 2 containers side by side. 1 glass, 1 ceramic. They were different, but they were both clean. The next morning, I walked past the Vance winery. The gates were shut, temporarily closed sign hanging from the latch. The garden was silent. Usually this time of day, the workers would be out. Today, there was nothing but an empty crate left on the stone steps, upturned like a dry bowl. I didn't go in. I kept walking toward the office. On the day of the wedding, the rain came out of nowhere. The outdoor courtyard was flooded. Sarah arrived early, helping the crew move everything into the gallery. The lumber had been prepared days ago, reclaimed beams, sanded down to show the original grain. The altar was simple, 3 steps high, set against the backdrop of the city revitalization models. The guests arrived, some with umbrellas, some in raincoats. Neighbors stood by the door, helping people dry off. My mother was there in a new dress, her hair perfectly styled. When she saw Sarah, she paused. Sarah was in the dress she designed herself, the hem brushing the floor, the patterns shifting as she moved. My mother didn't say anything. She just reached in her purse, pulled out a piece of red ribbon, and tucked it into Sarah's bouquet. Sarah, she whispered, you're a good woman. Before the ceremony began, I stood by the altar. I saw Sarah adjusting her earrings. In the light, the small freckle on her collarbone was faint but visible. Nervous? I asked, walking over. No, she said. Just worried the rain will ruin your shoes. It's fine, I said. It's not like I'm running away. She smiled and looked up at me. After today, you couldn't even if you wanted to. I'm not running, I said. I'm staying right here. The officiant took his place. The rain drummed against the glass ceiling. My mother sat in the front row, clutching a handkerchief. Sarah took my arm, and we walked forward together. As we reached the center, a sound came from outside. It was the neighbors. They had lined up with umbrellas, creating a dry canopy from the street all the way to the door. Sarah looked at me, her eyes misty. See? I said, everyone's here. She nodded and squeezed my hand. The officiant asked, Caleb Stone, do you take Sarah Jenkins to be your wife, to walk beside her through every season? I do, I said. When it was her turn, her voice was steady. Edo. As we exchanged rings, my mother suddenly stood up. She walked forward quickly. Without a word, she pulled a small sewing kit from her bag, knelt down, and quickly stitched a small loose thread on the inner lining of Sarah's dress. 1, 2, 3 stitches. She patted the fabric, looked up at us, and smiled. Sarah leaned down and gave her a long hug. I took Sarah's hand and led her to the door. The rain had stopped. A sliver of light was breaking through the clouds. The puddles on the ground reflected our company sign and our 2 silhouettes. Our shadows were linked, swaying in the breeze, but never pulling apart. Our shadows were linked, swaying in the breeze, but never pulling apart. Story complete.